There it is.
There we go.
Hello, everybody. My name is Erin Hulskamp-Bone. I'm the artistic director over at Opera Huntsville, and I'm so excited to be here tonight with a bunch of really cool people, and in particular, Jaie Deschene, who I had the privilege of working with. I'm not going to say how many years ago, but several years ago, and starting back in the day, we put a show together for the MIT Gilbert and Sullivan players, and we have reworked this show for the Rocket City here in Huntsville, and we just know you guys are going to love it. And before we do the show, though, Jaie has agreed to give us a little insider's view of who Gilbert and Sullivan are and how the show came to be. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to her, Miss Jaie Deschene.
Hi there. I am Jaie. Thank you very much for being here. I to say I'm the librettist for the upcoming show is perhaps generous, as I stole a lot directly from Gilbert and Sullivan. But I do know quite a bit about them, and that is what I'm here to discuss with you this evening. So as the presentation goes on, if you have any questions, things that interest you, things you'd like more information about, please feel free to chime in. Don't be afraid to interrupt. That's a great way to engage. And without further ado, let's see if we can make this Ben. All right, sharing my screen. You are sharing your screen. All right. And all right, can everybody see the title slide? Loading. Little tease there. All right, can everybody see the title slide?
Yes.
Perfect. So, as the title suggests, this evening we are going to discuss the lives and works of Gilbert and Sullivan, two of England's best beloved, England's best beloved dramatist of the Victorian era, and one of England's best beloved composers of the Victorian era. To give you a little overview of what this talk will encompass, we're going to learn about who Gilbert and Sullivan were individually, and what it was that brought them together, and incidentally, what it was that tore them apart. That is the carpet quarrel, which we will get to in time, and you will see why it's called the carpet quarrel. Then we're going to go into the operettas themselves and talk about each one a little bit. And then we're going to discuss some common tropes and themes that pop up in Gilbert and Sullivan's works, not only from the dramatic standpoint, where, that would be Gilbert's stock characters and his sense of topsy-turvydom, but also the music that tends to show up in every Gilbert and Sullivan show. So we'll hit both of them there as well. And then there are a few final questions I would like to leave you with at the end of this presentation. So getting started, by the way, I just want to draw your attention briefly to the titles of each slide up there highlighted in yellow. Each of those is actually a quote from a different Gilbert and Sullivan show. And if you're curious about any of those, just pipe in. But otherwise, I generally won't spend too much time talking about those. Sir Arthur Seymour Sullivan, he was born May 13th, 1842. And he was the son of a military bandmaster. So you could say he sort of had music in his blood. In his early years as a boy, he mostly sang in boys' choirs. And it was there in one of his boys' choirs that he composed his first anthem at the age of 8 years old for his choir to sing. So that was quite the achievement for a young lad. As he got older, he was the first person to ever receive the Mendelssohn Scholarship from the Royal Academy of Music. And that allowed him to study both there and in Germany. Forgive me, my German pronunciation is not what it used to be, so I will not attempt the name of the conservatory in Germany, but you can see it for yourself here. So he was recognized very early as um, having great talent in music. Um, some of his strongest influences, if you're particularly good with the ears, you might hear the influence of Mendelssohn in his work, as well as Rossini. Um, and he's according to my understanding, his work is generally very um, typical of the types of things you would be hearing in the 19th century. Um, he had some trouble with his peers who, um, because of his work in comic opera with Gilbert, they had a tendency to look down on him. He lacked, at least for a time, a sense of legitimacy. And that really kind of got under his skin, as you'll see in some of these later slides. Um, Nevertheless, he was knighted by Queen Victoria in 1883. Um, and even though we know Gilbert and Sullivan as a pair today, they did each do their own thing at different times and with other folks. So some of his notable operas, besides the 14 that he wrote with Gilbert, include The Zoo. You'll hear that one come up a lot. Gilbert and Sullivan groups like to revive that every now and again. He had a work called Ivanhoe, which is, I believe, his only officially recognized grand opera, such as it were. And Haddon Hall, which is a historically based opera that he, whoops. Anyway, there we go. Haha. And he was never in very good health. And actually died following a bout of bronchitis on November 22nd, 1900. Um, so that is Sir Arthur Sullivan. Note when he was knighted, it is sort of in the middle of his success with Gilbert and Sullivan. That is perhaps a contributing factor to things that would happen later. We move on to Gilbert. William Schwenk Gilbert. Yes, Schwenk was really his middle name. Um, he was born on November 18th, 1836, so he was actually quite a bit older than Sullivan. He grew up in not the best of circumstances. He was well off, but his family is thought to have been very emotionally distant. Um, for example, he had a rather cold, unemotional battle axe of a mother whose name was Anne. And he grew up with many, many sisters. And we'll touch upon this later, but it's been speculated that all of the female characters that appear in Gilbert's dramatic works are representations of either his mother or his sisters. And you'll see why going forward. Um, he attended the Great Ealing School as a boy, where he became head boy, which was quite the distinction. And it was there that he began writing plays. So both Gilbert and Sullivan began their craft while they were still in their boyhood. He later went to King's College in London. And funny thing, he almost went into the military, but the Crimean War had ended by the time he became eligible. So, and there were fewer recruits needed, so he just decided not to. And I think we're all reaping the benefits of that decision. He initially found fame with what are called the Bab Ballads. Now, what um, these were a series of poems accompanied by not exactly surrealist, but like comically absurd illustrations, all done by Gilbert. And in fact, several of them went on to become the inspiration for some of the plots of the operettas, as we'll see later. But people really liked these bad ballads, and they enjoyed them quite a bit. Um, it was also with these bad ballads that he first started um, developing his tendency toward topsy-turvydom, which is he enjoyed just reversing the social order. The master becomes the slave becomes the master. He really had a fascination with that particular dramatic trope. Um, and even beginning this early, many of his works contain very thinly veiled jabs at um, sometimes very specific policies and specific politicians. Um, so he was always sort of courting courting social danger in that respect. Um, he was also knighted, but not until 1907. This was after Queen Victoria had died, so it was King Edward who knighted him. Um, Again, he also had works that he did without Sullivan, some of which include the play Engaged, which is actually quite often comparatively often revived, not just by Gilbert and Sullivan groups, but theater groups in general, especially because you don't have to pay to do it. It's so old. And another play called The Mountebanks, which is less often known, but was certainly significant at the time it premiered. And a sad story about Gilbert, he actually died of a heart attack on May 29th on 1911 while saving a 17-year-old girl from drowning in a lake on his estate. So that is the act of heroism that cost us Sir William Schwenk Gilbert. Moving onward, so to talk about Gilbert and Sullivan, you obviously they're known for their partnership, but something that is very much of interest is how that partnership came to be and how that came to dissolve. So Gilbert and Sullivan were brought together by a fellow named Richard D'Oyley Carte, who this is his photograph with his mustachio, and he ran a company that you will be very surprised to find out was called the D'Oyley Carte Opera Company, and his goal with that company was to put on specifically English produced operatic works. And he very quickly learned that comic operas sold the best, and so he brought Gilbert and Sullivan together to create these lovely comic operas for him. And actually, in their contract, they promised to create a full comic opera for him at 6 months' notice whenever he asked. So it is that way in which we have the 14 operettas that we have today. Gilbert never fully trusted D'Oyley Carte, and this was because technically under their contract, Gilbert and Sullivan were D'Oyley Carte's employees, and Gilbert felt specifically that they were essentially doing all of the work while D'Oyley Carte was reaping most of the benefit. Um, and so he came to resent that a little bit. And so that relationship was never on fully solid ground. To add to this, the relationship between Gilbert and Sullivan themselves was never on solid ground either. Sullivan always felt subordinate to Gilbert in that the way these operettas would come into being, Gilbert would write up the libretto first, including all of the lyrics to all of the songs, which means he, would set the meter to all of the verses. And it was Sullivan's job then to essentially set syllables. And he didn't feel like he was able to shine through the way he wanted to because he was effectively following up with Gilbert's master plan in all of these cases. And they both saw these works very differently. So Sullivan saw these works as operas, as you would expect him to, whereas Gilbert tended to see them as plays with some concerted music. Um, Things sort of came to a head when D'Oyly Carte wanted to build a new opera house and premiere a grand opera by Sullivan. And this strengthened further the bond between D'Oyly Carte and Sullivan, and kind of began to push Gilbert out. Cut to 1890. Um, there was a show that they were doing called The Gondoliers, and Gilbert managed to get hold of the list of preliminary expenses for the show. Now, these expenses these were things that were considered necessary for the presentation of the show, and would be taken out of the show's initial profits. He was outraged to find that for £4,500 were to be taken out of the profit for the show, including, and this seemed to incense him the most, £500 for new carpets for the front of the theater. He, for some reason, kept harping on that particular number, and this just further, further soured his relationship with Richard D'Oyly Carte. He immediately wrote to him and he threatened to quit, saying that it was because of him and because of Sullivan that Carte had any sort of success, any sort of fame, and he owed everything to them, and how dare he cut into their profits by inflating the numbers so outrageously. He eventually wrote to Sullivan for support. Sullivan, being no fool, at first attempted to play both sides. He would make nice with D'Oyly Carte, he would make nice with Sullivan, but ultimately and unsurprisingly, because D'Oyly Carte was all set to give him his opportunity to write the grand opera that he always wanted to, he settled with Carte. He sided with Carte in the issue, and this was the nail in the coffin that would bury Gilbert and Sullivan's working relationship. As I'd mentioned, the tension between them had sort of been growing steadily for years. This was where it kind of all fell apart well and truly. Incidentally, the opera that D'Oyly Carte promised to produce for Sullivan was Ivanhoe. So that is how Ivanhoe figures into this story. It was briefly floated past Gilbert and Sullivan that maybe they should write a new contract wherein they get more money and things were worked out better for them. But it was Gilbert in the end who refused this new contract. So it never ended up getting signed. Even after the carpet quarrel, they were persuaded to write 2 more operettas together, although at this point, they really couldn't even stand to be in the same room with each other. So most of what was done remotely. And I find that very interesting. And it's generally believed that these last 2 operas suffered greatly for the animosity that was between them. They were Utopia Limited in 1893 and The Grand Duke in 1896. And neither were as successful as the operas that went before, and neither are considered to be as artistically successful either by people who are aficionados of Gilbert and Sullivan. And in fact, they're often skipped in rotation by Gilbert and Sullivan groups. So you'll see groups who will say in their materials, we perform all Gilbert and Sullivan operettas except for Utopia Limited and The Grand Duke. So that tells you what these gives you a little bit of an idea of what people think of these shows. That's a good segue into the operettas themselves. So the first time Gilbert and Sullivan ever collaborated with each other was actually independent of was before before they really sort of hit the ground running. They collaborated on a show called Thespis. Um, and in this show, the basic plot was the gods and goddesses of Mount Olympus had grown old and they needed a vacation. So, who better to hire to take their places than a troupe of actors who promptly mess everything up? This is the only Gilbert and Sullivan show that has been almost entirely lost, unfortunately, in terms of music. We have the libretto, we have the lyrics, we don't have most of the music. And the music that does exist was cannibalized, if you will, for other things. Excuse me. One moment. There we go. It wouldn't be until 1875, or rather 1874, that Richard Doyley Carte would bring Gilbert and Sullivan back together to write a short opera, one-act opera, called Trial by Jury, which later premiered in 1875. This is their only one-act collaboration, and it was written as a curtain raiser for a longer opera. And the story basically is of a young man who must defend himself in court when his former fiancée sues him for breach of promise of marriage. And it's an interesting show because you start to see all of the Gilbert and Sullivan tropes begin to form. And they would later go on to solidify in The Sorcerer, which premiered in 1877. It is their, because Thespis has been lost, it is their oldest full-length collaboration. And the story of the Sorcerer is that a young, naive Victorian couple, they want the whole world to be as happy in love as they are. And they hire a sorcerer to help them, but his methods go a little bit awry. And soon the classes mix together in ways they shouldn't in polite Victorian society. And hilarity ensues, as I'm sure you can imagine. In 1878, Gilbert and Sullivan really started to find the success and acclaim that they would become known for. Starting with HMS Pinafore in 1878. This was the first of what is known as the Big Three in Gilbert and Sullivan. You'll hear more about the Big Three later, but these are, as you can well imagine, the three most popular shows that Gilbert and Sullivan ever worked on together. The three that draw the largest crowds, are most beloved even today. And in HMS Pinafore, various characters on board a Navy ship struggle with their romantic feelings for people from other social classes. So again, here we have Gilbert and Sullivan playing with, or Gilbert especially playing with social classes and people reaching above and below their rank in life and poking fun at these artificial barriers that people impose on themselves. 1879 would see the premiere of The Pirates of Penzance, which is the biggest of the big three. And, this tells the story of a former pirate with a single-minded devotion to duty, and how he gets sucked back into the pirate trade when a loophole in his contract is exploited. That loophole involves leap year, and if you're unfamiliar with the story, I highly recommend checking out Pirates of Penzance in some form. Sorry, clicked a button. Highly recommended. It's very funny, and there's a reason it's as beloved as it is. Interestingly enough, Pirates of Penzance was the only Gilbert and Sullivan work to premiere in America first. It opened first at New York's Fifth Avenue Theater in 1879 before it ever hit English shores. This was followed in 1881 by Patience, which actually is my personal favorite of the operettas. Um, and this was Gilbert's response to the aesthetic movement that lasted very briefly in the 1880s. It was a style movement, a poetry movement. Um, Folks like Oscar Wilde were involved with this. Basically, there were ways that you dressed, ways that you thought, ways that you wrote, um, and it was Gilbert found the whole thing very ridiculous, so he decided to poke fun at it in this enduring opera. And the plot is such that all maidens in the village have forsaken their old loves, who were soldiers, to follow a pretentious poet named Bunthorne, Reginald Bunthorne. But he only cares for the simple and down to earth milkmaid named Patience. And it's all about the problems these characters create essentially for themselves. Um, and as I mentioned, aestheticism itself was relatively short lived in the Victorian era. Not a lot of people nowadays know about what that was. So, and for that reason, Patience is often performed today in updated versions. You get a lot of really high concept Patiences. Um, Various social fads have been substituted for the aestheticism, including goth culture, hipster culture, beatniks, hippies, and that's just to name a few. There are plenty other Patience adaptations out there. It's a rabbit hole if you ever want to dive down one. Um, and another interesting fact about Patience, it was the first production in history of anything, first theatrical production in history ever to be lit entirely with electricity. So that's a cool little factoid. Then in 1882, we come to Iolanthe. The picture on this slide is actually of a character from Iolanthe. She is the imposing fairy queen. Iolanthe centers around a half human, half fairy, who is denied permission by the Lord Chancellor of England, of Parliament, to marry his ward, which prompts the fairies to come to his defense. And with their magic, they send him into Parliament, and bad things happen. Well, depending on who you are, bad or good things happen. Um, This continues Gilbert's tradition of characters who largely create their own issues, and impose barriers upon themselves by investing their faith in laws and restrictions that have no actual real world consequences. For example, there is a rule in the play that no fairy may marry a mortal. Why? Nah, they just cause. Um, Onward, we come to the middle years. Here is where things, I'm not going to say things start to lag a little bit, but it's the the methods and the madness become tried and true here. Princess Ida premiered in 1884. It's actually based on a poem by Tennyson, which was written in blank verse. And the dialogue itself is written in blank verse, um, which has some really interesting consequences. Um, in it, a prince comes of age and must claim his bride, only to find that she has run off and started a school where only women are allowed. Um, at the news of this, he and his companions, they infiltrate the walls of the school and dress as women, and the results are everything you expect and perhaps some stuff that you don't. That is what I will say about that. I encourage researching this one if you are interested. Um, the poem, so the show mainly follows the plot of the poem by Tennyson, with the exception that Gilbert changed the ending to one that is a lot less feminist. Um, and in fact, because of this, many current productions create their own version of the ending, which is a lot closer to the original poem, which I won't spoil for you, by the way. Um, no, stop it. Sorry. All right. Sorry about this. Next, we come to the Mikado, which is the last of the big three. Rather unfortunately, as you'll see. Um, in the Mikado, a town executioner is out of his depth when he finds he must carry out an execution before the arrival of the Mikado, Japan's emperor, or else lay his own head on the chopping block. Um, for reasons you can surmise, Mikado is very difficult to do today. This is because largely it has been casts of white performers performing as Japanese characters or pseudo Japanese characters, and it is it hits a lot of unfortunate buttons for today's audiences. Um, Productions have tried to get around this. For instance, you'll see somebody did a Western Mikado at one point, which was an interesting choice. Um, some Mikados, they just English it up and take all of the Japanese influence out of it, except for what is in the script. So no kimonos, just suits, things of that nature. Um, the success of these endeavors is debatable, um, and it may be worth looking at the Mikado with even greater scrutiny in the future, to see if it's possible to see if it's possible to revive it at this point. But it is and has been considered one of Gilbert and Sullivan's big three for as long as it's been in existence. So it is certainly worth discussing. Um, this was followed by Rudigor in 1887. And that picture that you see on the side is actually from a character from Rudigor. A young nobleman tries to escape his family curse by masquerading as a townie. And once he's found out, he must commit the curse itself is that he must commit a crime every day for the rest of his life, or else face the wrath of his ancestors' ghosts. Um, this piece is a favorite for modern producers because there is a lot of opportunity for cool visual effects. The ghosts are actually characters. They are written to step out of their picture frames, which is always a cool thing. They are, they do ghostly magic upon the lead character at one point. It's just a really cool show. Another thing about Rudigor is that its name was the subject of some controversy because it rhymes with a Victorian expression, bloody gore, which to the Victorians was considered a curse word, on the order of, dang it. So uh, people were initially a bit up in arms about this title, but um, those people are gone and the show remains. So uh, we come to 1888. Um, the Yeoman of the Guard. Um, in this show, chaos erupts at the Tower of London when a prisoner escapes after making a political marriage to a woman he's never seen. And I know that sounds like an odd description, but I invite you to watch Yeoman of the Guard and try to describe it any other way. It is a very twisty, turny, um, very convoluted in I think a great way. It keeps you on your toes. There's always something to be revealed. Um, it is Gilbert and Sullivan's only true in finger quotes historical work, since it features an actual historical figure, Sir Richard Chumley, and the inclusion of Sir Richard kind of non-negotiably places the action in the year 1521. Um, it is arguably the only Gilbert and Sullivan operetta that is not really a broad comedy, in that many people think that it has a tragic ending. And it is considered by many to be as close as Gilbert and Sullivan ever came together to grand opera. And at last, we have the declining years. So, as you'll remember, the show that they were doing at the time of the carpet quarrel was the Gondoliers. The Gondoliers is an interesting show in that one of two gondolier brothers uh, is the king of an island called Barataria, but nobody knows which of them is actually the king. So until it can be determined which one is the king, both have to bear that title and the burdens that come with it. And meanwhile, they're married while being betrothed to another woman, and it just gets very messy and very funny very quickly. Um, the structure of this show is unique in that it essentially has two principal casts that don't cross paths until the end of the show. And it is believed that the reason for this is that um, somebody was complaining to Gilbert about how um, certain roles, certain voice types, dramatic types aren't featured enough in a dramatic way. And Gilbert kind of took that as like a challenge accepted, and he essentially wrote these two principal casts into the same show, um, which actually makes it fun to rehearse too, because there are people in the show that you don't get to see if you're one of these characters until late in the process, and it's just it's a very interesting experience. Um, of course, after the Gondoliers was the Carpet Quarrel, and the last two shows that Gilbert and Sullivan ever did together. Utopia Limited. In this show, the island people of Utopia are welcoming their princess back from her trip to England, where supposedly she has learned what it takes to make their nation great. But the transfer of ideals is not as smooth as expected. Um, as I said before, this is omitted from rotation by many Gilbert and Sullivan performance groups. And this is largely because it has a lot of problems. Um, there are plot holes and structure problems. For example, a romantic subplot that is introduced in the first act is never resolved or even referred to in the second. Um, and that is just one of the things that holds Utopia back. It's also rooted very firmly in Victorian imperial politics of the time. So it doesn't transfer very well to to today's audiences. And the final show they collaborated on together was The Grand Duke. Um, this incidentally, this plot actually echoes their first collaboration, where an actor is made Grand Duke through a series of legal loopholes, and chaos ensues when he discovers that he is legally engaged to four different women. Um, at this point, as I said, Gilbert and Sullivan weren't on speaking terms. And some people think they were actively working against each other, in that the lyrics and the dialogue are at times meant to step on Sullivan's music, while Sullivan uh, seemed to show less regard for Gilbert's rhythms. Um, it is also the longest of the operettas. Uh, if it's unedited, it clocks in at about 3.5 hours. And for this reason, it's often skipped in rotation, or if people do perform it, they tend to perform it with very heavy edits. Um, Side note, when I directed this show, we removed an hour of material, and it was still 2.5 hours long. So take that as you will. From there, we come into the characters that you will find in a Gilbert and Sullivan operetta. Um, to understand this, you have to understand that Gilbert and Sullivan wrote for a repertory company. So they would always have to find ways to fit in all of these different performers that they had at their disposal. And what naturally grew from this, and what naturally grew from Gilbert's sort of pet obsessions, was a collection of repeating character and dramatic tropes that you find in nearly all of the operettas. Um, the inspiration for some of these came from, of course, politicians, the Navy or the military, artists. Gilbert loved to poke fun at artsy folks. Um, he loved to compare country and city folks and rich and poor folks. And he tried on numerous occasions to poke fun at the clergy with varying degrees of scorn from the public. Another thing that needs to be noted here is Gilbert's portrayal of women. they he was not a terribly feminist person, shall we say, in that women, and this is reflective of the way women were viewed in the Victorian era. They were rarely seen as being serious creatures. They, their only concern was of being good marriageable quality. Um, they were often portrayed as being naive and childlike, or if they were older, imposing and overbearing. And as I said before, it's been said that every female character in a Gilbert creation is based on either his sister or his mother. And with that, we leap into the tropes. So, two major Gilbert and Sullivan tropes show up for ladies. That is, the first is the leading soprano. She is always conventionally beautiful but unintelligent. She is generally helpless and a slave to her own beliefs. She is rarely saved by her own agency. And examples of this, particularly good examples of this, are Rose Maybud in Ruddigore, Patience in Patience, and Yum Yum in The Mikado. By the way, these names that you'll hear for The Mikado should give you some idea of why it's difficult to perform this show today. The other female trope that shows up for Gilbert and Sullivan is the contralto battle axe. She's always a stern and unyielding personality. She is accepted as old and ugly even by herself. And she's generally frightening to other characters. Chronically rejected by her romantic interest and sometimes married to the villain of the piece as his punishment, which is hysterical. And examples of this include Cadishaw in The Mikado, Lady Sophie in Utopia Limited, and Dame Carruthers in The Yeoman of the Guard. We come to the gentleman. There's usually the farcical public figure, usually a politician, or he fills some other high rank in society. He owes his success either to dumb luck or money, but definitely not to his own industry or genius. He is mostly a thoroughly useless individual who does next to nothing and is acted upon by the plot rather than advances the plot himself. Examples of this include the Lord Chancellor in Iolanthe, Coco in The Mikado, and Sir Joseph Porter in HMS Pinafore. Then we have the handsome tenor. He, like the soprano, is conventionally handsome, but extremely unintelligent. He is obedient to a fault, puts a large amount of faith in arbitrary rules that eventually cause his own problems, and he is, by all accounts, a natural match for the leading soprano. Examples include Frederick in Pirates Penzance, Rafe Rackstraw in HMS Pinafore, and Nanki Poo in The Mikado. And finally, we have the big bad bass baritone. He is often very frightening for some reason. Either he'll be ugly, or he'll be a ghost, or he'll be bloodthirsty. He has something about him that makes him unsettling to the other characters. He is often of very high rank, either socially, royally, or otherwise. And he knows he's terrifying and delights in this fact. Examples include the Mikado, Dick Deadeye in HMS Pinafore, and Sir Roderick Murgatroyd in Ruddigore. Now we come to some storytelling dramatic tropes that you'll find in Gilbert's works. Um, One thing that he loved was topsy-turvydom, and we touched on this before. But to be clear, this is when a situation is turned completely on its head. Um, Gilbert often liked to do this with social class. He liked to do this with people in positions of power, um, how they sort of often having the people who are in the highest positions accidentally undermine themselves through their own idiocy. You'll see that a lot in Gilbert and Sullivan's works. And this very topsy-turvy mechanism is at the heart of most of his plots. Another thing you'll see a lot is obedience to a principle. Um, Often this will mean that a character is dedicated to a flawed principle and will allow this to bar them from achieving their own happiness or making their own decisions. Um, you see this examples that come to mind are Patience, who believes that love must be unselfish, and so she will not allow herself to love the beautiful man who loves her. Um, Frederick in Pirates of Penzance, who is a slave to duty, and even though there is nothing else compelling him to go with the pirates because it is technically his contractual duty, he feels he must. And this leads into a romance that is often barred by circumstance. Oftentimes, this circumstance is the bogus obedience to principle, but sometimes it's a little bit more legitimate. Um, and then plots in Gilbert's shows tend to be thickened and or resolved by legal technicalities. Gilbert really loved legal technicalities and the almost and not almost and just the sheer silliness behind some of them. Um, I'm tempted to spoil a few, but I'd rather you find them on your own and be like, "What really? That's what he's going with? Okay, then," because that's how some of them are. Um, and of course, there are musical things that pop up in all of the operettas as well. Each of the operettas has both a men's chorus and a women's chorus. And these choruses are mostly separate, each having their own time to shine. But occasionally they'll do a double chorus. Um, each operetta has at least one patter song. Some of them have several. Patter song, for those of us who don't know, is a song that is sung very fast, and I use the term sung rather loosely because it's mostly speaking on pitch, if that. Um, there's always a romantic duet usually between the tenor and the soprano, but sometimes it mixes up a little bit. Um, there is nearly always a madrigal for at least 3 voices, usually 4. Um, and it will appear in the darndest of places. You kind of can spend a Gilbert and Sullivan show waiting for the madrigal to happen, and it almost invariably will. They're also known for their lengthy first act finales, which have multiple parts and most closely resemble what we think of when we think a typical grand opera. So that is the gist of the presentation. That is most of it. Before we go, I want to leave you with a few things to consider. Are the works of Gilbert and Sullivan still relevant today? Why or why not? Why have their works endured for so long for so many people in the English-speaking world? Why are they still so beloved today? And finally, I would like you to consider what can be learned or gained by not only discussing but performing Gilbert and Sullivan and their works for the modern audience. And with that, I think we come to a hopefully satisfying close.
Thank you so much, Jaie. That is just a lovely presentation. It really gives us so much information and background on who these characters are. Is there anything in particular referencing some of this information about our show that we're preparing to perform on April 9th, 10th, and 11th that you would like to highlight?
So what you'll see in our show is a lot of what we talked about in terms of character tropes. We're really drawing on that a lot because that is one of the signatures of a Gilbert and Sullivan work. You'll also see a lot of the obedience to a principle to the detriment of one's happiness. Because you can't have a Gilbert and Sullivan operetta without that. And something that I am particularly excited by is that each of the existing shows, so that's not Thespis, but everything that came after, is represented musically in our production. So you will hear at least one song from each of the Gilbert and Sullivan operettas that currently exist. So that makes me very happy.
Great. Well, we have maybe like 2 minutes to take any questions. I don't know if anybody has anything particular they wanted to ask about, any burning questions out there. It's okay if you don't. Feel free to speak up if there is anything.
I just want to say that I really enjoyed it. I learned a lot about Gilbert and Sullivan. I mean, I knew some of it, but I didn't know all of it. And I feel like you gave me a very good overview. And I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
I have a question. Did Gilbert and Sullivan, were they the ones that first invented the patter song, or was that around before they started?
That I'm not sure. You do hear patter songs as going back as early as their first collaboration. So I'm not sure if they invented it, but they certainly they popularized it.
That's really cool. Thank you.
There are also lots of patter songs in Italian opera, not just English opera. So it's not something that's monopolized by the Brits.
I have a question. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question. How do I say this? How self-aware or serious should we play these characters? I don't like does that make sense? Like it's campy, it's goofy. Like should we lean into the camp and like be self-aware of the camp, or should we like be genuine with it? But I don't know.
So that is ultimately an Aaron question, but I can tell you what would have been done in the original Gilbert and Sullivan productions. The characters are not generally self-aware.
Okay.
They're what makes the situation funny is, at least in the original context, is that everybody is absolutely serious.
Okay, thanks.
But I think what has happened in this production, as I think our characters have become self-aware of these tropes, and I think it's because we've taken so many of the ideas and sort of infused them in odd ways into the show. I think it would be more fun to play it as self-aware, but we'll see how it comes out when we get into rehearsals this weekend.
And I think there are lots of if you consider self-awareness of character a scale, I think there's lots of places you can fall along that scale.
Awesome. Well, I think these are all great questions. It really, honestly, I can't thank you enough, Jaie, for giving us this presentation and for pulling together all the lyrics and just really the order of the show and everything. We could have done it without you, and I just can't wait to dig into rehearsals beginning this Friday. For anybody out there who's kind of following along, and if you haven't purchased tickets, please go to operahuntsville.org to do so. It's going to be a lot of fun. I can tell you this, if nothing else, you'll walk away smiling and laughing and humming the tune. I don't think it's gonna be stuck in there. So did you want to add any last comments?
No, thank you all for sitting through it and for giving me your time and attention.
Excellent. Thank you so much, everybody.